Okay, today we're going to look at the development continuum. This is another bit of theory towards the start of the development unit, which is trying to account for and describe and order the way countries and societies have developed and how they've spread out along a kind of development sort of scale, as it were. Now, before we do this, I just want to revisit Rostow for 2 minutes. Just to recap, Rostow suggested that countries went through in a certain order. Now, what we've kind of added to that since 1960, when Rostow did it, was some labels for countries. So countries that we would say are still traditional societies, we would call them least developed countries. Okay? Countries that are hitting that precondition for takeoff are what we would call emerging or developing countries. Countries that are taking off, we might term rapidly industrialising economies. Countries that are on their drive to maturity, we might refer to as newly industrialised economies. And then countries with high mass consumption are what we might call most developed countries. So, again, we're trying to label and put countries in certain boxes at certain stages of development. Now, I'd like to just contrast this very quickly to another model which you may or may not have heard of, which is what Brandt has done. Now, Brandt, bless him, was an economist in 1980, and there was a massive report, and he essentially divided the world into two. He divided the world into a rich north and a poor south. He said these are most developed countries, these are least developed countries. And that was his line. Now, clearly, such an arbitrary line and such a broad brushstroke of definitions and sweeping statements is somewhat out of touch in today's world. But perhaps 40 years ago, levels of development in different countries were perhaps less varied and less dynamic than they are in today's society. But you can see how we've got Brandt with two definitions. We've then got Rostow with his sort of 5 stages there. But all these things are doing, Brandt and Rostow, is they're trying to label countries. They're trying to label countries in terms of their level of development. Now, how you measure that development is something else. Do you use GDP? Do you use HDI? Do you use wealth, health, etc.? But they're trying to label countries into a certain level. They're trying to put countries in boxes, as it were. Now, the development continuum is suggesting that actually you can't really do that very easily. So the development continuum says, in actual fact, if we looked at, say, and this is a rather nice little Gapminder map, and this is looking at, on this x-axis is GDP per person. It's a log scale. And this up the side here, which has been cut off slightly, is the health, and it's measured by life expectancy at birth. Now, there's a clear trend here. I'm sure you can see that countries with more money have a greater life expectancy at birth. There's a clear positive trend. The size of the circles here relates to the country's population. The colour relates to the continent they're in, as you can see here. There are clear exceptions to this rule, but there's a clear broad trend. Now, if we use Brandt's north-south divide or use Rostow's 5 stages of development, we would have to try and draw lines here somewhere to categorise these countries, to group them. And whilst you can see there's a clear trend of countries that are less developed down here and are more developed up here, how you try and divide them is really, really difficult. And in reality, you can't really put certain countries in certain boxes. Also, you want to consider the fact that these countries are moving. Countries that are highly developed may change in terms of their wealth, their health, in terms of their status. An awful lot of countries down certainly South Asia, certainly parts of Africa, certainly parts of South America, a lot of their development indicators, GDP, health, that kind of thing, have massively progressed in the last 30, 40 years. So it's really hard to box countries in. So the idea of the development continuum is to say, right, let's not try and label countries. Let's not try and put them in boxes. Let's just be happy with the fact that countries are progressing. Some countries are moving up the development continuum, so their wealth is increasing, their life expectancy is increasing. But equally, war, be it civil or international, disease, things like Spanish influenza, poor governmental policies such as Mao's Great Leap Forward in China that killed roughly 20 million people, and other factors like that can all contribute to a country actually moving backwards down the development continuum. So Rostow said all countries should move up it with good governance and with the idea that every country wants to develop. But in practice, that doesn't always happen. And if you go on the Gapminder website, you can look at these changes over time. And what you'll see is a really interesting pattern, with most countries progressing in this direction. And this ultimately, this zone up here is high income, long life expectancy countries. But why countries move here changes. The rate at which they've moved here has changed. And some of them have been moving backwards at certain times for various different reasons. So the whole idea of a development continuum is not to try and put countries in boxes, to try and get away from these labels of more developed or less developed or rapidly industrialising or newly industrialising. So what point a country flips from one box to another is very difficult. The idea is more to see it as a trend, with the ultimate objective really of getting up here. So again, it's theoretical, and it looks at it conceptually, but it perhaps gives a more open way of showing how development changes.